You're listening to a CNA podcast. Have you ever driven an electric vehicle? Well, one of the first things you'll notice is just how quiet they are. You can practically hear the surface you're driving on. But the EV space is getting noisier. China has a lot to do with that. Sure, we all know Tesla, but BYD, short for Build Your Dreams, is giving the American automaker a run for its money. I'm Teresa Tang. Buckle up. In this episode, we're going to cover all things EV with CNA's Olivia Seong in Beijing and Henry Yin in Singapore. Olivia, Henry, thanks guys for joining me today. Good to see you.
It's nice to see you too as well, Teresa.
You know, driving, it is a rite of passage for many people growing up, myself included. I want to start off by you guys telling me if you drive or not. Do you drive?
I do drive. I tried to get my license as soon as I could. And I do actually quite enjoy it, having your own space, carpool karaoke or solo karaoke with no judgment. I've driven in Singapore and Beijing, but I have to say Beijing is a whole different ball game. That traffic, there's so much going on. So it has been quite an interesting experience.
Henry?
I think driving in China, for me, especially in Beijing, hasn't been a walk in the park. So back in the days, snagging a gasoline car plate, I remember, was still like, finding a needle in a haystack. It was really so tough. So, Beijing, in order to tackle the crazy traffic and pollution problem, the capital city rolled out this so-called bi-monthly car plate lottery system in 2011. Now picture this, every couple of weeks, they'd pull a plate out of the hat for every more than 2,000 hopefuls. So I got my driver's license in around 2012. So I jumped on the bandwagon in 2013. But guess what? Until last year, 2023, 10 years, I think Lady Luck hasn't been on my side yet. So still waiting for my big break on the roads.
What, for 10 years?
Yeah, exactly.
That sounds like an incredibly time-consuming process, Henry. But now we know the Chinese government has been incentivizing people, right, especially the younger generation, with things like subsidies to draw them to electric vehicles. Some people are saying, those subsidies, they initially did attract buyers, but now people are really interested in the cars themselves. Olivia, how regularly did you see electric vehicles on the road in Beijing?
Well, it's become fairly common to see EVs on the road. Even when you call a cab, you get an EV cab, or with the ride-hailing apps. The shopping area next door to where I've lived for several years, you see these very sleek car showrooms. There are foreign brands like Tesla. Increasingly, though, we see more domestic brands like Li Auto. And if you travel south to, for example, Shenzhen or Guangzhou, you see a whole lot of EVs on the road. We're talking about full fleets of buses and taxis, all electric. And one of the interesting observations is that it's very noticeably quieter on the roads in the south, where there are a lot more electric vehicles, because that's where the big automakers like BYD and XPeng are located as well. And we know that China is the largest EV market in the world. More than half of the EVs in the world, it's just unimaginable, run on the roads here. And speaking to drivers here, they say, they like EVs because it's green. And there are now many options, and the technology has just, become a lot more reliable, and it's also cheaper for many of them with the subsidies that are available. Overall, the stats show that in China, the penetration rate for EVs reached 35% last year. In 2022, it was 25%. And this boom has been very much government-driven, pun intended. Starting in 2009, there was a whole series of policies aimed at developing this strong domestic EV industry and developing it fast. China back then, it already had a very big auto industry, but what it wanted to have was its own brands to be able to compete with the incumbent automakers. And the other goal also was to scale up quickly, and they had to make EVs affordable. And one think tank suggests that over 130 billion US dollars was spent on research incentives, government contracts, consumer subsidies, although we have to note that the subsidies for consumers were gradually reduced and phased out at the end of 2022. But at the end of last year, $72 billion in tax breaks were also announced for new energy vehicles bought from this year to 2028. And that really explains this boom in EVs that we see in the last few years.
I got my license as well as soon as I could. And back then, electric vehicles were not a thing. You know, it seemed like such a concept of the future, but here we are. Henry, you're listening to Olivia and her observations in China. You were in China visiting family just last month. Did you see what Olivia is seeing?
Well, indeed, absolutely, Teresa. So let me take you guys to a trip down a memory lane. Remember those days when we used to, geek out over car logos with my friends, right? So, I mean, who could forget the thrill of, quizzing each other on which logo belonged to which brand? But, fast forward to my recent trips to China. I've been to Shanghai, Beijing, and Guangzhou. And wow, talking about a whole new ball game and green place. They're everywhere, almost on the streets, belong to those EV gang. They've totally taken over the street. And let me tell you, it's like, stepping into this, like, what Olivia mentioned, futuristic wonderland. You've got brands like BYD, NIO, XPeng, and the list goes on and on. And, this rise, they've straight out of, like sci-fi movie, I kid you not. And we've seen those sleek, modern designs that make you feel like you just about to blast off into space. But also, I gotta admit, I was, sweating bullets just trying to find the doorknob before hopping into one of those, bad boys. Yeah. I think, that cannot be separated with a lot of, incentives rolled out by government. For example, Olivia mentioned a lot. And simply in the capital city, last year alone, Beijing issued 100,000 new car plates to the car buyers last year. And 70% of those car plates, went to EV drivers. So you can see how much the government is trying to ask people and try to persuade people and encourage people to buy EVs.
And it's just so much easier to get a car if you choose the EV route with that lottery system. Maybe, are you thinking of trying it, Henry?
Perhaps I will, if I can find the doorknob.
I've had those confusing moments too, I have to admit.
Right.
So build your dreams, BYD. They passed Tesla in worldwide sales of fully electric cars late last year. They're really on the move. And listen to this. They've got plans to set up assembly lines in Thailand, Mexico, Uzbekistan, just to name a few places. And their exports to Europe are on the rise as well. So, Olivia, do you think they're going to be looking at Tesla in the rearview mirror from here on out?
Well, if you look at the numbers, it's what dreams are made of, right? BYD sold a record 3 million new energy vehicles last year, net profit up 80% year on year. In China, it takes up about 35% of the market share. It's the only one that has more than 10% of the market. In second place is Tesla, and they only have 7% of the market share. BYD is also backed by billionaire investor Warren Buffett. We also saw a study released this month by a German institute saying that BYD actually got at least 3.7 billion US dollars in direct government subsidies to achieve what it has today. And we hear of all those plans, but really, if we were to look at it closely, it may not be all that rosy amid this global slowdown that we are seeing in demand for EVs and the economic challenges facing China. And BYD delivered just 300,000 battery electric vehicles in the first quarter of this year. And that's actually down 43% from the final 3 months of last year. And, we were talking about those consumer subsidies ending back in 2022. And we have seen actually EV car sales slow down since that initial frenzy. A total of 7.7 million battery electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles were sold last year, growing 36% in 2023, which does sound like a lot. But when you compare that with 2022, when we saw 96% growth, that is a huge reduction. So still growing but slowing for sure. And we now see in March, BYD continuing to cut prices for many of its models in order to woo customers, and prices they are cutting by for some as much as 20% downwards.
And we know it's not just BYD in this market, right, Olivia? There are a lot of players in China. XPeng is one of them. And you actually sat down with the billionaire chairman of that company, and he sounds pretty optimistic. What was he like in person?
Well, considering that we did that interview pretty late in the evening, it was about 9 p.m. local time, because that was the only time that we could arrange with his team. He was surprisingly candid in sharing his views. And, what struck me was really his assessment of the current EV market and the state of play, and very aware, it seems, of the challenges in the road ahead, given the very intense competition that we're seeing. He said the ongoing price war as automakers battle for market share could last for 2 to 3 years, and that could be a bloodbath. Already reports are saying that, in 2019, there are about 500 car makers here, but this has already dropped to about 100 in 2023. And even then, we see new entrants to this market with, for example, electric maker Xiaomi launching its first electric sedan in April. And, at the same time, we hear Tesla talking about cutting its workforce by 10% globally this year. XPeng, though, the chairman tells me that, he wants to be the number one auto brand in China by 2030. Mm-hmm. They are still far off numbers-wise, sales-wise, when compared to BYD, but it's setting its sights on the international market, hoping to enter 20 new markets this year, including Singapore, the UK, Australia. He spoke about, ironically, going slow and ensuring innovation and that its tech is really sound. Have a listen to He Xiaopeng. He is the chairman of XPeng.
We all know that there is a saying that a soldier who does not want to be a general is not a good soldier. So we must have such an ambitious goal. This is the first point. Second point, why set this goal? I still think that the next 3 or 4 years will be a knockout tournament, and the following 4 to 7 or 8 years will be an all-star competition. So in this field, in 2030, we can probably see the abilities and feasibility of the top 1 and top 2 players during the all-star game. I think this is a very important point.
And Henry, I want to highlight an interesting point that you made in one of your reports, and that is the dilemma that the West faces. On the one hand, they really want to protect their markets from this onslaught of cheap EVs from China. But then, on the other, import restrictions could really hamper their clean vehicle market ambitions. Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, that's right, Teresa. So we've seen those Chinese-made electric vehicles, really stirring up a storm of controversy in the corridors of power in both Washington and Brussels. It's actually a pretty tangled web of trade-offs. So Europe's, is now quite nervous over a potential flood of cheap Chinese car imports. Of course, I'm talking about a sort of nightmare scenario for, car makers already struggling to keep their heads above water, local car makers in Europe. So what's the solution? Now, at the moment, the EU is toying with the idea of slapping import tariffs on these, domestic car makers in China to keep the competition at bay. And also pumping the brakes on these imports could throw a massive wrench in Europe's grand plan to go green, with fossil fuel emissions on the chopping block and deadline to outlaw currently the traditional cars and gasolers by the year of 2035. The last thing they need actually is to stifle the electric vehicle market. And quite ironically, if we look at the US market at the moment, despite we haven't seen any BYD cars running on main streets, but trucks, buses produced by BYD have been there serving US customers for years and offering also, tens of thousands of job opportunities in the country. And those trucks and buses are actually local made from California.
So, speaking of China, it's no secret the Chinese economy, it's really struggling right now. It's got a huge problem with real estate that could take years to fix. But this EV boom in the country, do you think, Henry, it could help change its fortunes?
Unfortunately, the simple answer is no.
No.
Despite we see, electric vehicle sales shot up a whopping 35% last year, we have to admit one fact that is, even with all that electric energy buzzing around, it's still not enough to shake off the drag from the ongoing housing sector crisis. So according to the latest estimates from Bloomberg Economics, the electric vehicle sector chipped in about 1.6% of China's GDP last year. It's not too shabby, right? But hold on to your hats, because here's where things get real interesting. Well, that's a bump up from 1.2% in the year of 2022. It's still peanuts compared to the whopping 19.4% coming from the property sector. Yep, so you heard that right. So when it comes to contributing to big GDP picture, those electric rides still have a long way to go before they can outshine the heavyweight of China's economy, that is the property sector.
Yeah, it's got a long way to go. I don't think the EVs are going to help very much in that regard. It's not all green lights ahead, though, Olivia. Can you tell us about the biggest challenges that the domestic auto market in China faces? And I want to start off with the hundreds of factories that were actually producing internal combustion engine cars. What is going to happen to them?
Well, Henry was talking about the challenges with the economy and the role of the EV sector, but and we have seen authorities talk increasingly about the transformation of its traditional industries, its traditional manufacturing industry. So that is something that they are working towards. But there is also, we have to remember, a cost perhaps to rapid development. Reports have revealed a large number of abandoned EVs in some parts of China, as some ride-hailing companies that bought and used the earlier generations of EVs for their fleet have gone out of business. And then China's economy is another big challenge for automakers. Q1 GDP growth, we have heard, came in at a very glowing 5.3%. But this wasn't driven by consumer spending. In fact, March data showed slowing retail sales growth, indicating persistent weak domestic demand. And in the first 3 months of this year, we saw the slowest quarterly growth for EVs since the second quarter of last year. And the government has launched several schemes to encourage consumers to trade in their cars, to drive sales of EVs. Automakers are also looking abroad. But how successful will they be is the big question, given there's this overall slowdown in EV growth, EV demand rather, globally, especially in Europe and the US after the initial wave. There are also additional challenges with those tariffs in Europe that Henry spoke about. Many are looking abroad, especially to Southeast Asia, to try and drive sales. But we do know that Europe and US are huge markets for these automakers. But I think we also have to remember that even as we talk about the big picture and these statistics and the economy, don't forget too that the technology is still being developed as well. And as we speak, continue to be developed. We're talking about better features, longer driving ranges. And speaking to other drivers though, there's still some skepticism from some quarters about the reliability of the cars, the convenience of charging, making them reluctant to actually make the switch. At the end of the day, it's very much still about the user experience. And a friend of mine here, her name is Kayleen Hong, and she has lived here in Beijing for 8 years, and she rents and has been driving a Chinese brand EV for a few years now. And I was pretty floored when she told me about this harrowing experience she had in the freezing Beijing winter. We're talking about negative 17 degrees Celsius, driving an EV.
Oh, wow.
You just have to have a listen.
So about 15 minutes into my journey, I was left with only 75 kilometers. And I was like, okay, I better rush to get back. I still had another 20 minutes to go. And then another 5 minutes later, it suddenly dropped to 25 kilometers. And then the next minute, literally the next minute, it was down to 0 and it started flashing and said, the car is going to stop. There's no more battery. So I was forced to, filter right at the right side of the expressway. And I really saw my life flash before me because there were so many trucks that was speeding past me because it was in the middle of the night. It was about 11:30 p.m. And that was really a horrifying experience. I had to call a tow car. So I think at that point in time, it made me feel like, okay, in extreme conditions, driving an EV has challenges that I would never have expected.
So yeah, there's still many things that need to be worked out, even though people, I think, do see the benefits of having or driving an EV. But as the XPeng chairman told me as well, the car industry is really a marathon. And so we'll have to see how things develop and innovation carries on.
That is a scary clip. And like you said, it is at the end of the day about the user experience, right? When you forget about all these big picture things, it's about how we feel about these cars. And we are talking about clean vehicles just days before Auto Shanghai kicks off. It's taking place this weekend. It's a biennial event and it was canceled last time due to COVID. And it is China's biggest auto exhibition. Olivia, EV is going to be front and center, I assume.
Yeah, I do think so. It will be one of the things we'll be looking out for, how brands position themselves in this crowded, increasingly competitive market, new launches, technology, prices, sales, all in focus as part of this talk about having EVs play a key role in boosting China's economy. But it's not just domestic. I mean, there's a lot of international focus on China's EV market as well. So there'll certainly be a lot to look out for.
Yes, I still remember before 10 years ago, I covered the Shanghai Auto Show. I remember BYD was the only brand that is on exhibition in that year's event in Shanghai. Mm-hmm. And I've talked to a lot of buyers at that time. Their main concern at the moment was what will happen if the battery dies down and amid, extreme cold weather in northern cities like Beijing. So I guess really people's way of thinking changed a lot throughout these years. And I'm sure we can see much more exciting features being announced in the auto show this year.
All right, Olivia, Henry, thank you so much. We covered a lot of ground. And like you guys say, it's going to be really interesting to see where this EV race heads from here. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And a reminder to our listeners that the TV episodes of CNA Correspondent air every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time. The team behind this week's episode is Saya Win, Clara Ong, Crispina Robert, Craig Dale, and myself, Teresa Tang. Thanks so much for joining us.